I think you come and take a seat. Okay. Look like your usual handsome self.
No, that's difficult.
Not in that suit, buddy. Hi, Eva. Thank you for coming. Are we starting, or are we waiting for anyone hanging around outside?
It's 6 p.m.
It's 6 p.m. in Warsaw, or it's noon in London, Ontario.
Yes.
All right, should we do this?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Camera guys, are you ready?
Yes, it's right.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you for coming to join us on this rather cold and dark Thursday evening in Warsaw. Thank you to those of you who came to join us in person and to those of you who are watching online. I am very pleased to be able to introduce you to Dr. Oleksa Drachewycha. Oleksa is joining us from Western University in London, Ontario, in Canada. Oleksa finished his PhD in 2017 and studied Russian Soviet history. Subsequently, he produced a book on the Leftist International, which is available in libraries and bookstores. And he's currently working on 2 new projects. The first of which is a new textbook on forms of global totalitarianism, and the second of which is what he's going to talk about today. And he has produced a very fabulous manuscript, which it was my pleasure to read a couple of months back, comparing Russian and Soviet atrocities, so making comparisons between the Second World War and the events we've seen, which have shocked all of us in the last couple of years. So Oleksa is going to talk for about 45 minutes, all in English, I believe. Unless he wants to throw some Ukrainian in, just to throw us all for a loop. And then there'll be some time for discussion and questions. So those of you who are here, please save up your questions, and Oleksa will be very happy to discuss with you. So without further ado, please, Oleksa, take it away.
Thank you very much, Ian, for that wonderful introduction. And I just want to take a moment before I do start just to thank all of you that are here in the room, that are online, for joining me today. Also to thank Ian for starting this process of getting me, at least sort of throwing the idea of me coming to Warsaw, to the Pilecki Institute, for all of their hospitality. And I specifically want to highlight the efforts of Ursula Terbiak for all of her logistical help to get me here. And safe and sound. So today I'm going to just talk about a number of examples from the research that I've been doing now for over 2 years. And since the escalation, since Russia's escalation in Ukraine beginning in February 2022, there has been a lot of discussion about what has driven Putin and Russia to escalate in Ukraine. And through this has led to historical memory being one of the key sort of lenses that has been used to try to explain what's happening. Scholars have focused on how Vladimir Putin sees himself as a historian and how he has utilized Russian and Soviet history to develop some unifying force in Soviet society. There's this sense that this is a way for him to develop also a kind of national image. And in many cases, this is drawn on a variety of different things, whether it is the long history of Imperial Russia, Peter I, for example, becoming increasingly important, whether it is his desire to rebuild the Russian Empire, his desire to focus on Soviet history in terms of utilizing certain episodes to promote a certain narrative, or in the area that I have been spending a lot of time going over and should not be in any way unfamiliar to anyone following events with regards to Russia's war in Ukraine, and that is the instrumentalization of the Second World War, and particularly the Soviet history of that, of the Second World War. It's often in Putin's Russia framed through the lens of the Great Patriotic War. This allows them to overlook, and intentionally so, needing to talk about certain events like the Nazi-Soviet Pact, which, if they are mentioned, there's usually suggested as, in taking directly out of the page of the Soviets, this claim that the Soviets liberated Ukrainians and Belarusians in Poland, and that is sort of how it's framed, but usually the focus is on 1941 to 1945, particularly looking at what happens after the Germans invade with Operation Barbarossa. But also in that is that there is this development of a heroic narrative, one in which the Soviets did no wrong, the Soviets fought valiantly against the Nazis, and this victory over Nazism is the number one sort of key aspect. Usually it also conflates Soviet as Russian. This also allows Putin to instrumentalize this history, often focusing on the issues and the problems of collaboration in other parts of Central and Eastern Europe, while ignoring Russian collaboration with the Nazis or any issues of defection and things like that. This is well-worn territory. Nothing here I'm saying is particularly controversial, and nor am I really in any way sort of adding anything in that respect. But I do want to sort of highlight that historical memory. I think we can go a little bit farther with regards to how we consider it. We have seen how this has sort of been now seen as not just Putin's war, but Russia's war. And looking at how historical memory and developing this sort of national approach where the Second World War means so much more to sort of the average Russian citizen. This then leads to when Putin makes those claims, how, for example, how the so-called special military operation is denazifying Ukraine and drawing on that history. It's familiar. This is a history that most in Russia will have in some ways interacted with, whether through textbooks, whether through online exhibits, museum exhibits, general sort of public events, and so forth. And this has led also to many to highlight again where this narrative of denazification is not new. It took place in 2014 when Russia first invaded Crimea after the Euromaidan protests. And again, Russia claimed it was denazifying Ukraine there. And that led to that narrative coming back in 2022. This has even led some scholars like Roman Horbek, who has referred to this as the Little Patriotic War. Highlighting again how historical memory of World War II is instrumentalized to attach a certain meaning in terms of Russia's efforts in Ukraine. I agree with all of that. I agree with the scholarship that's been happening where they see Russia in some way replaying the Second World War, hence also the name of my talk. I think we need to go further, though. And I think what we need to do is we also need to consider the history and the legacy of atrocity in that as well. Particularly, that includes the atrocities the Soviet Union committed through the Red Army, the NKVD, Smersh, or so forth, from roughly about 1939 to about 1950. So focusing on the whole history of the Second World War, but also what happens afterwards. And I argue that Russian officials and Putin have demonstrated a deeper knowledge of this history. As I mentioned, Putin sees himself a historian. He claims he's looked at the archives, he's looked at the documents, and also in order to be able to censor this history, he would have to be, and so would Russian officials, be in some way familiar with what the actual history is. And this also leads to a number of things. For example, how they can then repeat or utilize this history in specific ways, and I'll give a few examples, but also how it allows them to denounce certain sort of factual attempts to highlight Soviet atrocity, again, being here in Poland. There's a long history of both Soviet and Russian denial of their role in the Katyn massacre. That is part of all of this as well. And then through my research over the last couple of years, I've highlighted sort of three categories that we can put a various number of events when looking at the history of both the Second World War and Soviet atrocities during and after, when comparing them to Russian atrocities in Ukraine today. And so that comes in a couple of ways. First, parallels, which highlight similar atrocities on war crimes, But this allows us to do a couple of things. One, these are areas that as a scholar, even if I might think that there might be more there, I think that in many cases that this is the scale of the number of parallels and echoes suggests more than coincidence. But at the same time, I don't have Vladimir Putin saying we're going to do this exactly as we did in the Second World War. We're going to commit these acts. Instead, usually there's a number of different ways that we can develop sort of at least a comparison or at least connect the two events, either through how they're similar, echoes, parallels, and so forth, or that the government or state media utilize a very similar approach, if not the same approach, to get the same results. And in many cases, this is exactly what has happened, and I will use the example of dehumanizing rhetoric to show that towards the end of my talk. The other examples are implicit inspirations. This is where the Russian government or the Russian military or security forces are likely drawing on the Soviet past through policies that would be familiar to them through institutional memory or various formal and informal norms. To give an example, there's a straight line connection we can make between the NKVD and the FSB. We can do the same thing also with the Soviet military to the Russian military. And we can assume that there would be connections or at least a familiarity with certain policies or certain activities. Filtration camps, for example, being a great example of this. Then there are explicit cases, places where the Russian government, Russian officials, state media explicitly make reference to the history of the Second World War and the Soviet Union. And in this case, this is where they are trying to directly connect the Soviet effort there to the Russian effort in Ukraine today with regards to their policies. And I'll outline a few. To give also just a quick sort of overview, just to give a sense of the scope of my study, my book, my manuscript focuses on 5 categories: the rhetoric of denazification, sexual violence, mass murder and torture, forcible movement of people and theft of goods, and the weaponization of food. So again, this is, I will only be giving a small sort of piece of that study, but it gives you a sense of, again, the scope, where this is not just a couple of examples. This suggests where there is at least a broad way in which this historical memory is being instrumentalized to lead to all of these various connections or comparatives. And at the same time, there are also other aspects to this, and I'll mention a couple towards the end, of how also Ukrainian national memory has made some of these connections as well. So to start, I'm going to focus on some of the explicit connections, just to give you a sense of, one, how varied some of these examples are, but also to suggest that there is at least a general widespread knowledge of certain things, which would make this, allow me to suggest that there's at least a general knowledge of a deeper narrative that may not necessarily always be known by the general Russian public or utilized in that way, but clearly Russian officials, state media, and so forth are aware of it. So, just to name a few. Last year, Russia's imposed leader of Crimea, Sergei Aksyonov, he declared that the Russian-occupied territories needed their own SMERSH, needed their own counterintelligence force, to root out those who refused to recognize Russian control of the region. For those of you who are familiar with SMERSH, this is the acronym Death to Spies, and no, it's not just part of the James Bond movie canon, although you probably have heard at least SMERSH through that in some way, shape, or form, it being the inspiration for Spectre. It was used by the Soviets in a variety of contexts: denazification in Germany, through the role in fighting Nazis, working alongside the NKVD. They were also involved in the operation of the filtration camps during the Second World War. And Aksyonov directly referred to their actions during the Second World War. And Andrei Gurgalev of the Defense Committee of the Russian State Duma then claimed that such an organization was not only necessary, but was revived. Now, there's been a lot of disagreement about to what extent, whether this has actually happened. I think that's irrelevant. I think in this case, just the fact that they're referencing SMERSH, and this is also in line with a growing almost revival, at least with some idea of a public memory of SMERSH, with a number of movies and various other entertainment sort of items that highlight the role of SMERSH in Russian history. We're seeing again them drawing on a specific memory that's rooting out of disloyal individuals or people who might run counter to the actions of, in this case, the Soviet Union, and tying them to what Russia is seeking to accomplish in Ukraine. And another example, one that many of you might be at least familiar with or have heard of, the use of criminals on the front lines. During the Second World War, Stalin allowed those imprisoned in the Gulag the opportunity to fight for their freedom, literally, in penal detachments that were often placed on the front lines, with the idea being that they would be put in a position where most likely they would die. But if they managed to survive, they would essentially have their freedom. As part of this, Stalin made the announcement for penal detachments in Order Number 227. Some of you might be familiar with that, as that is the not one step back order, which also is believed to have been implemented by the Russian military today in some way, shape, or form. But the Russians have also revived the practice of sending criminals to the front lines, particularly violent criminals. And Russian spokesperson Dmitry Peskov seems to have even read Stalin's speeches with regards to this. In November of 2023, he announced that Russian convicts can, quote, atone for their sins with their blood. This is identical to the phrasing Stalin used. That is not a mistake. It's not just a sort of thing that he decided to throw in there. That is a direct way in which they are trying to connect the Soviet war effort in the Second World War to the Russian effort in Ukraine today. Meanwhile, Dmitry Medvedev also got involved in this as well, engaging in a similar use of drawing on Soviet efforts during the Second World War. Again, focusing on a specific moment to highlight how there seems to be a general detailed knowledge of what the Soviets did. For Medvedev, this came in March 2024 when he posted, I'm going to call it Twitter, I'm sorry, I can't call it X, it's Twitter to me still. But he tweeted that, quote, various Nazi bastards who wish death on Russia, like Rinkevich, the president of a non-existent Latvia, must remember the fate of the fascists, the 1943 Kharkov trial included. Retribution is inevitable, memento mori, end quote. Medvedev included also a picture of those who were tried at the Kharkiv trial in 1943, that they were all hung. They were all hanged, reflecting their executions. What Medvedev is referring to is the series of trials that the Soviets held during the war to try captured Nazis and collaborators. In July 1943, 11 men were charged and 8 executed for Nazi collaboration in the Krasnodar trial. In December of 1943, at the Kharkiv trial, 3 German Gestapo officials and a Ukrainian collaborator were tried and publicly hanged. I should also just quickly highlight an implicit connection, namely how those trials were used. You'll notice the year 1943. That was intentional. That timing was intentional. They were also used for propaganda purposes. That was the year where the Katyn mass grave was discovered by the Germans and then publicized. And the Soviets used these trials to try to distract from that issue, as they were trying to also, again, highlight that they were on the side of morality and fighting Nazism. The Soviets used those trials to try to shift attention away from any people asking questions about what really happened at Katyn. Similar, perhaps, this could be how, in the summer of 2022, Russian forces announced various war crimes tribunals. This is in the twilight of Bucha. Again, that's probably more of an echo and a parallel, but it's also interesting to see both the Russian government today utilizing a very similar tactic as the Soviets, again, drawing from this, given, again, this focus on history and historical memory and instrumentalizing it. I suggest there's more there, even if I might not necessarily have, again, that clear document. And as will be sort of noticed with a lot of these, for some of these items where there are so many coincidences and parallels, one of the challenges is that how much can we actually say, given that it's not like Putin and other officials are going to explicitly make those same connections, at least publicly. Among the most notable implicit connections, I can talk about filtration camps. Early after the escalation, reports surfaced of Russian forces setting up filtration camps. Should be noted that this isn't unique to Ukraine, Chechnya, for example. There's a notable history of Russia using filtration camps there, but there is an institutional history for us to draw on. And there are very many commonalities between how filtration camps were used in Russia's escalation in Ukraine to also the Second World War and afterwards. And this is something that also a number of other scholars have highlighted as well. Just as in the Second World War, individuals would be brought to either assembly transit or screen infiltration points. Just as in the Second World War, the NKVD, along with SMERSH, were deeply involved in the process, running it, while today we know the FSB is deeply involved in this. In the Second World War, the Soviets used the filtration process to ensure the ideological loyalty of Soviet citizens who they sought to repatriate. It also sought to root out collaborators. Now, today, Russian forces use it for a somewhat different reason, to ensure that Ukrainians who will then be moved into Russia will not cause trouble. It explicitly seeks to root out Ukrainians who are either too pro-Ukrainian, fought in the Donbass on behalf of the Ukrainian military, or have ties to the Ukrainian military. Meanwhile, the processes that people are put through are virtually identical. Just as in the Second World War, Ukrainians would move through the system, be interrogated. They'd have their documents taken, they're photographed, have their fingerprints taken. There are some modern twists today compared to the Soviet period. Obviously, they did not have cell phones back then, but now cell phones are usually taken and searched. Along with, there's also physical searches that are used, for example, to try to find tattoos that might be deemed something that could be at least either Ukrainian nationalist or could be claimed to be a Nazi symbol. As one Ukrainian official said, heaven forbid they just happen to have a tattoo of a trident, for example. That might be enough to condemn them. With regards to the review of phones, they'll often then review social media accounts. So for example, if you have a Facebook page and they are able to get access through your phone, if you happen to like something that Zelensky said, that might be enough to also condemn you. If they pass screening, they're then taken to a new site, often to be moved into Russia. And if they fail screening, they were often then held and tortured, again, much similar to the way the Soviets used the filtration system as well. There are also a number of implicit connections, for example, how Russian forces have forcibly moved hundreds, if not thousands of Ukrainians. And this is also just on top of their efforts to abduct children. One sort of side note I'll add here is the way that Russia today uses the filtration camp system to facilitate their abduction of Ukrainian children. Often, for example, Ukrainian parents will be placed through the system, and often they will be encouraged to have their child, for example, to be taken into Russia to engage in one of the various camps, give their children a break from everything. And then when the child is then brought back by Russian officials, when their parents are still going through the filtration process, they are then claimed to have been orphaned, and then they're put through the system where then they're brought back into Russia. And again, as we know, Russia is using this system to essentially remove Ukrainian identity, forcing Ukrainian children to learn the Russian curriculum and have inculcated upon them a pride in Russian nationalism, while also we now know in recent, just in the last couple of weeks, new information has come out about the scale in which Putin seems to be directly involved also in finding many of these so-called Ukrainian orphans places to live, suggesting, again, a much deeper systemic involvement right from the top. Again, this is one of those things that as more and more time passes, many of the connections that I've noticed are starting to become revealed more and more as not just the connections that the government will then reveal, but usually also we're starting to see just how systemic, just how much this is all dictated from the top. Meanwhile, for those who do go through the filtration camp system today, the Russians claim that many of these Ukrainians are willingly are happy to move into Russia. That, again, does not seem to be the case. There are some who move through the system hoping that they can just survive and then readjust. Many were able to escape initially through the Baltics, and now it seems to be through the Caucasus. But that said, is the Russians' attempt to again get these Ukrainians to rescind their Ukrainian citizenship, their Ukrainian nationality. For example, they're given travel vouchers and even encouraged to apply for Russian passports through an expedited citizenship process. And since 2022, we know that Russia has been forcing passportization on Ukrainians in occupied territories. And evidence is clear that Russia is seeking to repopulate Ukrainian regions with Russian settlers, most brazenly such that there have been documentaries that highlight real estate agents who are selling apartments in Mariupol, trying to get ethnic Russians from, say, Moscow or St. Petersburg to move into Mariupol and again effectively Russify that city. This is also done for a number of reasons. One, to de-Ukrainianize the region, but by Russifying it, it also ensures that their illegal annexation has this veneer of propriety, much like they moved Russian settlers into Crimea to then have a plebiscite to claim, look, this is clearly Russian. The same thing is happening there. This is all done to try to remove Ukraine from sort of the landscape, much as we see also in the Second World War, where the Soviet Union forcibly moved various peoples, such as the Crimean Tatars, before then changing street names, city names, and so forth. Russia seems to be doing the exact same thing in Ukraine today. Moving these so-called unreliable populations, and that would be the term that, for example, Russia would view them as, you see, again, another aspect of Soviet policy, which under the Soviet era would have been done by the NKVD. Today it's done by the FSB. And passportization was used by the Soviet government to control movement, to ensure that people would either stay where they want them to go or be forcibly allowed them to move where they wanted them to go. And it seems that Russia is borrowing from these policies. Now, there are some distinct differences with the filtration camps, for example. Their purposes on their face value, I think, appear different. The Soviets forced the repatriation of focused on the repatriation of Soviet citizens, whereas Russia's camps today focus on filtering Ukrainians for their transfer into Russia. I would argue, though, that I think this needs a little bit more interrogation by scholars, because if we look in how Putin views Ukrainians, seeing Ukrainians, and by Ukrainians I would argue good Ukrainians, that is, Ukrainians that are not resisting, that are willing to be, quote, liberated by Russia's, quote, special military operation. If they're just Russians, as he claims, in many of his speeches he has argued that Ukrainians are just Russians, then is he not just repatriating these Russians? And if that's the case, it suggests that these filtration camps are actually being used for almost the same purpose. And I think that's something that deserves much more investigation. And again, that would be something where it's outside the scope of of my study, but I think that there's an avenue for further analysis there. Another issue is, I should also highlight one other part to this that suggests not a clean comparison. And I only just highlight this to showcase that even if they are replaying the Second World War and many of these policies, they're also not necessarily following them to a T. They're often then having their own variations, and one of them is the issue of passports. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union saw passports and particularly Soviet citizenship as absolute. Once a Soviet citizen, you always were a Soviet citizen. And they wanted to control this. So therefore, that's why repatriation after the war was so important to them. They wanted to ensure that Soviet citizens, even if they were so-called disloyal, that they were under the control of the Stalinist state. Putin does not seem to be following that. Based off at least some of the laws that have come out, the idea is that if Ukrainians do not, for example, get new documents that affirm their Russian citizenship in the occupied territories, they will be forcibly moved. They will be essentially deported from Russian-occupied Ukrainian territories. Now, this is an area that I still have to do additional research, but if that does indeed seem to be the case, that would suggest a notable departure between Putin's use of passports and his view of citizenship and the Soviet period. Either way, this would suggest, again, where they're using certain sort of institutional policies for their own purposes today, while then reconsidering at least how they view these populations, moving away from, say, a Soviet approach to a much more modern Russian approach. Finally, I want to then focus on one of those parallels and echoes where there isn't necessarily a direct connection, but I argue that this is an intentional effort by the Russian government to utilize the same processes that the Soviet Union did to then lead to at least excessive violence, if not atrocity and war crimes in Ukraine. And that looks at how Putin, Russian officials, and the state media have utilized identical approaches as the Soviets did during the Second World War to dehumanize their enemy. Now, I don't need to go over the history of how Russia uses denazification as rhetoric. That would take me a lot of time to go through it all. But I want to just highlight how it was framed with the escalation. First, on February 24th, 2022, Putin announced the beginning of, quote, the special military operation, his euphemism for this, before justifying it. Quote, "You cannot look without compassion at what is happening there," Putin claimed. "It became impossible to tolerate it. We had to stop that atrocity, that genocide of the millions of people who live there and who pinned their hopes on Russia, on all of us. It is their aspirations, the feelings and pain of these people that were the main motivating force behind our decision to recognize the independence of the Donbas People's Republics," end quote. Declaring Ukraine the aggressor in the Donbas, Putin then argued that just as Ukrainian nationalists who collaborated with the Nazis during the Second World War, Ukrainians today would continue to, quote, kill innocent people. Putin continued, adding he wanted to, quote, bring to trial those who perpetrated numerous bloody crimes against civilians, including against citizens of the Russian Federation. End quote there. Putin then tied the escalation in Ukraine directly to the Russian memory of the Second World War. Quote, "The outcomes of World War II and the sacrifices our people had to make to defeat Nazism are sacred," he said. Then he appealed to the Ukrainian military. Quote, "Your fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers did not fight the Nazi occupiers and did not defend our common motherland to allow today's neo-Nazis to seize power in Ukraine. You swore the oath of allegiance to the Ukrainian people and not to the junta, the people's adversary, which is plundering Ukraine and humiliating the Ukrainian people," end quote. And this is what he used to claim that justified Russia's attempts to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Now, all of that, if you're wondering, no, there's no such Ukrainian genocide of Russians, and no, there's not this massive murder of Russians happening or this sort of deletion of Russian culture, what have you, in Ukraine that would have justified any of this. However, all of that draws on a very similar rhetoric, if not identical rhetoric, the Soviets used when talking about Nazi Germany. And I'll just continue here just with the present day, and then I'll highlight some of these direct connections. State media followed Putin's lead. Timofey Sergeytsev wrote in his piece What Russia Should Do in Ukraine in RIA Novosti, and he developed a broad approach that focused on a full military victory over Ukraine, the elimination of Nazism in all parts of Ukrainian society, culture, and politics, the investigation and imprisonment of war criminals, including through the creation of a war tribunal, directly referencing not only the during the war trials, but also Nuremberg, forced labor and public shaming of the, quote, Nazi accomplices, and de-Ukrainianization. He also said that Nazism was a social problem in Ukraine and that the state openly used education and culture to Nazify the population, therefore denazification would be needed. In order to do that, Russia would need to win in Ukraine. Ironically, he's probably also describing what might need to happen in order for Russia to sort of be pulled back from its aggressiveness in Ukraine. And I have argued that, for example, the only way that we might see Russia pull back from its particular aggression and its imperialism and its genocidal actions in Ukraine is through denazification there, nonetheless. Sergeytsev also sort of develops this approach, and this suggests that, again, following the history of the Second World War was what the Russians aimed to do. Meanwhile, we have enough anecdotal evidence at the very least to suggest that many in the Russian forces have certainly bought into this rhetoric. They saw Ukrainians, and especially Ukrainians who resisted as Nazis, and they saw that all Nazis must be eliminated. They see themselves as replaying the Second World War and fighting that same heroic fight that the Soviets did, and sort of seeing that historical memory motivating them today. In many cases, that's why also these efforts, the claims that Putin has that Ukrainians are committing a genocide in the Donbass is exactly what's also motivating the excessive violence by these Russian forces. That they see them as needing to be eliminated, that they need to be responded to with violence. Now, as I mentioned, there's no such genocide occurring with regards to Ukraine committing a genocide in the Donbass. But the Germans were using excessive violence and had genocidal intent with regards to the Slavic peoples in Eastern Europe. And that is what Putin is hoping to sort of attach his current interpretations to. That, again, if they are replaying the Second World War, see the Ukrainians in the same way as the Soviets saw the Germans. See them as the exact same existential threat to what, again, the Soviet Union faced during the Great Patriotic War, and then that is what Russian forces are doing here in Ukraine in the most recent years. And just to give you a sense about how, again, these connections sort of develop, I'm going to just give you some excerpts by what Soviet forces were told, how the media are sort of certain cultural figures, certain periodicals then also encouraged excessive violence. And you'll probably see some connections with how Russian state media fans the flames of violence in Ukraine today, or how even Russian officials have utilized a dehumanizing rhetoric to encourage Russian forces to act the same. So, for example, the Soviet military periodical Red Army stated the following during the Second World War. Quote, "Soldier, millions of enslaved Europeans look to you with hope, for the tears and the grief to the people who have lost their relatives hit the enemy harder. Soldier, the enemy wanted to exterminate many millions of people and left their bloody crimes traces in Russia, France, Poland, Greece, Denmark, and Norway. Let us kill Nazis. Death to Nazis." Soviet media then used images from Nazi camps to highlight the atrocities that they were committing. Think about how Russia uses various, again, sometimes doctored images or images from other wars to, again, fan the flames that Ukrainians are doing terrible acts to Russians. While the battle for Stalingrad was ongoing, for example, Jewish author Ilya Ehrenberg wrote the following, quote, "The Germans are not human beings. If you haven't killed a German in the course of the day, your day has been wasted. If you don't kill the German, he will kill you. If you can't kill a German with a bullet, kill him with your bayonet. If you have killed one German, kill another. Nothing gives us so much joy as German corpses." He later would regret this dehumanization as he saw what Soviet forces did in retaliation. And in one of the more famous anecdotal stories, when the Red Army reached German territory, a poster infamously proclaimed, quote, "Red Army soldier, you are now on German soil. The hour of revenge has struck." By fostering a situation where the state and state media promotes a narrative where the Ukrainians are allegedly committing a genocide against the Russians, just as the Germans had done before, and highlighting that they need to be destroyed, and then add all of the various other echoes, both the Second World War and Russia's war in Ukraine, for example, are both framed as holy wars, moral wars where the Russians are, according to the Russian narrative, on the right side of history. It spurs this action. It encourages not just the dehumanization of Ukrainians, but it then encourages excessive violence. This leads to atrocity. This leads to war crimes. And this then plays out in a number of different ways. And this is where you can see, for example, how this dehumanization then leads to the sexual violence that was widely reported in the early days of the escalation, to the looting, the use of violence, torture, the desire to essentially eliminate Ukrainianism in some way, shape, or form, this genocidal and imperial war that is happening. It is informed by this dehumanization. You even see this as, again, to highlight Ian Gardner's work, how he's highlighted that you see slogans like "we can do it again." They're referring to the Second World War and how the Russians certain segments of Russian population take pride in that they are openly replaying the Second World War and fighting this allegedly heroic cause. Ultimately, this leads to then ideas of revenge for this phantom genocide that they believe that is happening, but it isn't. This leads to then revenge. Often this revenge takes the form of power, in which, in order to ensure that Russian forces are able to maintain control, excessive violence is used to shock the population. Same thing for sexual violence. That's why many of these examples that you also have heard of are in many cases some way public. This also then leads to issues of command, in which it is widely believed officers allowed their troops to act with impunity. Alcohol also is often reported in many of the attacks that have been reported in either Western media or in various NGO or UN accounts and reports. And ultimately, this all goes to the top. Just to give another example of a connection, we see, for example, when Stalin was informed of the sexual violence on the Eastern Front, he said something along the lines of, "We lecture our soldiers too much, let them have some initiative," essentially brushing the atrocities they were committing under the rug. Later on, he would also suggest that he didn't want to hear it, or he pinned it on some black sheep or a handful of rotten apples in the Red Army, and not indicative of the entire military in any way, shape, or form. Putin seems to do some of the same, in which he either looks the other way or openly supports it, as we know when he gave awards, for example, to units that were implicated in the Bucha massacre. That suggests at the very least, even if Putin did not necessarily agree, or I should say initiate the massacre, he certainly condones it. And that also sort of is, again, another sort of eerie parallel in which sort of the flippancy that Stalin viewed life the same way Putin does as well with regards to the enemy. This all leads me to sort of come to some sort of final closing remarks, namely that this is just a mere selection of some of the examples. As I mentioned earlier on, I talk about the movement of people, the weaponization of food, and even how sexual violence is a genocidal act. I'm happy to also answer questions about that with regards to the Q&A or in any discussions after. But I also want to quickly highlight how Ukrainians are also making some of these connections, that they also see echoes to the Second World War as well. And that's also important to highlight. Obviously, one of the more notable ones is that, particularly with the weaponization of food, even with Margarita Simonyan claiming that that Russian forces are going to institute a famine in Ukraine again, suggesting they also are utilizing this history. The Holodomor has often come up as a clear example and connection between the Soviet past and what Russia is doing in Ukraine today, both seeing them as genocidal acts to eliminate Ukrainian nationhood. But there's also then specific moments. The destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, for example, was viewed by some Ukrainians alongside the Soviet destruction of the Dnipro Dam during the Second World War. Their Soviet forces destroyed the dam during Operation Barbarossa to try to at least facilitate their escape. The Germans also attempted to do the same, did not necessarily succeed, but again, there's this clear moment in Ukrainian history that they are making this connection to. As Russia's war against Ukraine continues, and as we learn more about what Russian forces are doing in occupied territory, and as Russian officials and leaders and state media continue to instrumentalize the history of the Second World War, I find myself increasingly finding these examples, connecting these two periods. There are too many coincidences to suggest that the connections are accidental, yet, as I will admit, I can only speculate in some of them, hence why I frame them as parallels or echoes as opposed to a clear connection. I suspect there might be a more direct connection, but only later researchers will be able to confirm that. To put this all another way, this is sort of echoes in another weird way Soviet historiography, in which we knew of the Great Terror when we knew some of the processes related to it, but it was only after the collapse of the Soviet Union that historians were able to then see a full archival picture of the Great Terror and be able to have a much deeper understanding of how those events took place. I suspect the same thing will happen with regards to Russia's war in Ukraine and the connections between the Second World War, or how some of these policies or decisions were made. Again, another example is how we now know today the NKVD planned the Katyn massacres, and it was approved right from the head of the NKVD, likely with Stalin's approval. I assume we're going to find something similar with regards to the FSB and some of the mass executions we see in Ukraine today. When we consider the discussions about historical memory and in the instrumentalization of history, especially with regards to Russia and the Second World War, we should also consider how that instrumentalization and how those actions can lead to atrocity, criminal behavior, and genocide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oleksa, for that fascinating, if harrowing, 3/4 of an hour. It's, of course, shocking to hear once again these organized plans and the parallels with such a brutal 20th century past, where we learn that those horrors haven't gone away, or maybe they went away and now they're coming back. So we have some time for questions. We have folks in the room, and anybody who is watching online, feel free to write your questions in the comments on the YouTube chat. I will try and pay attention in the room and watch the chat box on YouTube as well, and respond to questions. But I was wondering, does anybody have a question immediately, or can I fire away and use my privilege as moderator to ask Oleksa a burning question that I have? Okay, John's gonna go first.
Just one quick question, and one parallel that seems to be missing is that of ideology, which always makes me wonder, because even in the deportations into the Soviet Union, such an important part was forcing these people to adopt Leninism, Marxism, and so forth. But that doesn't seem to be part of the current situation unless you consider Ruski Mir, which seems to be a kind of an ideology, but not quite. So what do you think about that?
So there's a couple of things that I could probably suggest there. One is that I think just this idea of seeing Ukrainians, and again, I highlight the way that Russia would see good Ukrainians who are falling in line, willing to move into Russia. They're sort of accepting the Russian state, nationalism, this idea of a heroic nationalism. I think there's an ideology there. Nationalism always has that sort of ideological component, I think, there. But I also think sort of a better way is, this is where sort of looking at how deportations were used, especially during the war years, whether it was the Koreans, Chechen, the Ingush, Crimean Tatars, Volga Germans, etc. In those cases, it wasn't so much whether or not they were good Marxists or not, it was, were they viewed as disloyal? And I think in many cases that you see the movement of individuals who, in this case, whether it was the Soviet state then, again, claiming that all of these groups were collaborating with the Nazis, and that was used to essentially justify NKVD sort of wholesale moving up, gathering up all of these peoples and moving them farther into the interior, usually Central Asia or Siberia, and often with very violent results, high loss of life. I think there's a similar sort of process here in which that Ukrainians who, for example, do not at least performatively fall into line, that this idea that they're either going to be deported or will they be taken sort of into the Russian interior, away from family members, support systems, what have you? Will they be sort of left to fend for themselves in one sense? All of that is where then they're just, again, sort of eliminated from either sort of helping Ukraine in that way. At the same time, we have this idea that's starting to come out as how claims that not just obviously Russians who resist the special military operation, to use their term, the war, but also there's a number of reports coming out that Ukrainians, for example, who don't sort of play on, are then sent to the front line as well, with the idea, especially in occupied territories, that they are then to defend Russia's occupied territories against their own nation. And so that also suggests this idea that they can either be loyal or they'll be basically put in harm's way, which again, for Russia, benefits them much at the same way with the Soviets moving the populations away from, again, their homelands and further into the interior, it then no longer makes them either a factor, at least in how they view the war. And again, in that, where ideology, I think, plays more of a role is in how Russian forces see Ukrainians. And that's sort of, again, where we're still getting a sense for how, again, what's happening with regards to the occupied territories. We obviously know about the harsh occupation policies, but there's still sort of the issue of collaboration, for example, is a topic that's starting to get some discussion, but we still don't know kind of how it's developing, under what lines. Is it a pragmatic decision? Is there an ideological aspect there where you're seeing Ukrainians to survive, okay, we'll accept what the Russian state is offering more just to protect themselves? Again, anyone who knows the history of collaboration knows that motivations run the gamut from agreement with the so-called, quote, liberating force to survival. And I think we're going to see the same thing again with regards to Russia's war in Ukraine and Ukrainians living in occupied territory. But I think it's too soon to say anything for certain there. So.
Perfect, thank you. Who's next? All right, while you keep thinking, I'm going to ask my question to Oleksa, and that is, we've seen in the media a lot of discussion about whether, quote-unquote, ordinary Russians are complicit in the violence, in the atrocities, if they have some sort of moral responsibility for what's happening today. And so I was wondering if you could comment about your perspective on that, because you've talked a lot about the state and what is happening in Ukraine, but not the kind of the mass of the people. But could you also comment, given that you're trying to compare the past and the present, on the issue of complicity in World War II? Because again, we think, the popular narrative is that we had Stalin and the Red Army leadership, and then we had this sort of chaotic, marauding Red Army coming through Central and Eastern Europe and committing all sorts of atrocities. But what about the broader public? What did they think? Are they complicit? What are the scholarly perspectives on this?
That's a great question, and it's something that I've been thinking about for the last couple of years. And this is where I think actually when we're looking at this topic just broadly, I've been a big proponent on really highlighting how we have a lot of analysis on so-called totalitarian regimes, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and how consent and coercion work. And I think that those are extremely helpful to help understanding, one, what is happening, but also how we deal with things like complicity and, quote, ordinary Russians. Again, even the term ordinary Russians is a term that has its echoes with Christopher Browning and Ordinary Men, and explaining how, in that case, Hamburg Police Battalion 101, a group that was not particularly, sort of doesn't stand out as ardent Nazis. In many cases, many of them were not necessarily ardent Nazis. They weren't necessarily all notable anti-Semites, and yet they commit one of the largest massacres of the Holocaust. And I think this sort of leads to a number of things, which is, when we're looking at the Second World War for the Soviet Union, I think the general sort of, I should say there's a consensus, but there's a growing sense that actually in many cases, the nationalism, that sort of this defending their motherland, that resonated quite a bit, and also the role of the Orthodox Church and these traditional sources of quote-unquote Russian nationalism that the Soviet Union then co-opts played a key role in mobilizing people, especially with regards to Russia. And you see similar sort of things with regards to the various republics. And so, one, you see this sort of focus on defense. And I think we're seeing a lot of comparisons today in which those same sort of traditional parts of Russian society are again being utilized in a similar way, again, to build this sort of at least consensus or support that you're touching different parts of society to, again, get buy-in in some way, shape, or form. I think that on top of that, you have then sort of, again, the role of imperialism. There's this sort of sense that where, again, Russia, the Soviet Union, has always sort of seen itself as a great power. I think that always also plays a role in terms of, again, people want to know that their state is important. So that also gets some buy-in today, much like it also with the Soviet Union. You had people who either bought into what the Soviet Union was selling, were going to catch up and overcome the West, to then the Nazi invasion, even, for example, vindicating some of Stalinist propaganda, and that plays a role there. I think then when we look then for the actions of the Red Army, for example, is in many cases, you have to also remember that these are, in many cases, working class, lower class Russians Ukrainians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, as part of the Red Army. In many cases, many of them were directly affected also by what the Germans actually did, and that the violence the Germans brought when they invaded the Soviet Union. And that context we need to remember is there with regards to the Red Army, in which for many of them they saw what the Germans had done into sometimes their home communities, or they knew of family members affected or what have you. And so there was this sort of desire to also extract some punishment and revenge. So therefore, the propaganda lands as well. In today's landscape, it's a little bit different because I think disinformation and misinformation play such a powerful role in a very different way. And so, again, this is where the propaganda sort of, I think, resonates with a lot of people, especially when Putin has been building, under Putin, this focus on sort of the cult of the Second World War has really developed since he returned as sort of the president in 2012-ish or so. This is, again, it's all familiar. This is a history people can grab onto. They might have familial connections, so you can get by in that way. Add then the Orthodox Church. So you have a number of ways in which people can grab into what it is and at least support the war effort. As for broader issues of complicity, this is where I think scholars need to be drawing on, again, that literature with Nazi Germany, with the Soviet Union, whether it's Kotkin speaking Bolshevik and how people use the language of the regime to either protect themselves or to, again, sort of act like they're being good Soviets and hoping that that might help them out. We know that, especially regardless of whether you buy the veracity and accuracy of, say, Levada polling. People are using the language of the regime. And so does that suggest that there's at least some buy-in, or is it also in the sense of that it's repeating the same narratives? And that also then adds to what I like to refer to as the veneer of permanence, is if you continue to sort of develop this sort of situation where even if people are actively not resisting or protecting themselves or have perfectly sort of, in that case, legitimate reasons to not get involved, they're worried about their family, for example. Quote, where we look at ordinary Russians or ordinary Germans, to give another example, we know in Nazi Germany that the majority of the population either performatively did what the regime wanted or ultimately did not necessarily see themselves as ardent Nazis, but they had to be part of the Nazi organizations. They needed to be engaged in Nazi society. They had to make their appearances at the various sort of, again, if there was a rally nearby, or they would see, again, the pomp and circumstance of the regime and realize resistance wasn't possible, or they worried about their family over sort of doing the moral, the broader ethical consideration. All of that leads to sort of this sense of what role does bystanderism play, or onlookerism and so forth. And that sort of aspect has become further theorized, especially in recent years with Mary Fulbrook and Christopher Browning, and I mentioned Kotkin earlier. I think that there's an opportunity for us to look at that literature to really have then a more nuanced discussion about the role of complicity, especially in Russian society today, in which looking at how volunteers in the Russian forces obviously are much more complicit. They're actively engaging in the violence. But also, for example, Russians who don't resist are complicit in their own way by adding to the veneer of permanence. And this is where I go into that sort of issue of where, for me, a future in a world in which there might be a chance where let's just say Ukraine is victorious, and I hope they are, and able to liberate their territory, and Russia is defeated, why I see some sort of form of denazification, or at least borrowing from that sort of concept, is necessary, because it will be needed, because this is not, no matter what we want to say, solely the elites, solely state media. There is, to some degree, a broader buy-in in Russian culture and society. To what level? Scholars will disagree. Nonetheless, as we've seen with Nazi Germany, as we've seen with the Soviet Union, that buy-in is very powerful, and that veneer of permanence is equally as powerful. And that is also sort of what, as long as that veneer of permanence remains, that's only going to help, sort of hurt Ukraine, but also help Putin, his regime, either maintain control. And I should also highlight the issue of the violence that the regime also at least purports to use, and many people fear is real. And that plays also another role in adding another layer into that sort of consent versus coercion. We should really be looking at Putin as at least akin to some of these regimes we would deem as totalitarian. So.
Okay, perfect. I believe we have a question online, which I'm going to try and read. Perfect. So somebody asked online, thanks for sharing this intriguing talk. It was intriguing. Is brutality just part of the Russian military DNA? Atrocities have occurred in many wars, the Russian Civil War, Chechnya, Syria. What's different today?
Great question. This is where I will first preface this by actually suggesting brutality is part of the human DNA. I firmly reject the idea that this is the Russian soul is responsible for the violence being committed. Instead, my argument is more, this is something that the Putinist state and state media have created the environment for dehumanization and violence. Even though we can name examples of violence in Russian society and Soviet society and keep going back, we can do that with virtually every society if we really wanted to. And for me, it is like to sort of one of the challenges that I had when I first started this and when I'm writing my manuscript was the fact is that if I really wanted to, every single belligerent during the Second World War committed similar atrocities. In one sense, the Soviet atrocities are not necessarily unique, and in fact, that's one reason, for example, the sexual violence committed by the Red Army, part of the reason that it was able to be silenced beyond also communist control over the Eastern Bloc and Soviet control of occupied territory was the other allies committed similar atrocities as well. So there was this sort of desire of no one's going to bring it up because, again, every nation will just point fingers at the other. And that's also part of the history of the Second World War. I think, however, what makes then in this case, what's unique is not, again, that it is some part of the Russian military DNA or the Russian DNA, but instead the state has recreated through its instrumentalization of the Second World War and this history, the same conditions in which it leads to the same atrocities and war crimes. And in this case, this is sort of for Russian political leaders, they have created this culture where, for at least the Russian military, and again, whether it's the FSB and even Russian society, is okay with the violence, is okay with dehumanizing Ukrainians. And I think that is a far more useful way, but it also, I think, if we focus on so-called, and again, I use this just because this is how it's usually framed in certain discussions, it comes down to the Russian soul. It lets the rest of the world off the hook in the sense that every other society can potentially do the same thing. And I think that's one reason why, for me, one of the most important books that I used when sort of considering explaining some of these atrocities is Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men, in which his argument is that these were not, for Police Battalion 101, they were not ardent Nazis. They were not necessarily openly anti-Semitic. In many cases, they commit the atrocities they do because of the conditions they are in. They either don't want to be left alone by their comrades, they don't want to be othered in their own sort of groups, or the officers are the ones giving the orders and they wanted to then be good soldiers or what have you. Even though and as Browning points out, they all had the opportunity to leave. And those who did elect to leave were not, at least physically, harmed. And I think that's sort of the general lesson there in which we're seeing, again, where officers, for example, are turning the other way with regards to the atrocities being committed today. We know that plays a role in ensuring and at least having a better chance where atrocities happen regardless of the military. And so that's where I would sort of, again, I think the lesson there is that this is less sort of a specific Russian problem. What's unique is how this Russian state has created the conditions for, at least in this specific context, for the dehumanization of Ukrainians and the atrocities and war crimes that have taken place.
Perfect. Thank you, Oleksa, and we'll go over to Pavel.
Thank you for this wonderful and very inspiring lecture. I am very much looking forward to reading your book. So it's not going to be a question, sorry, perhaps, but more of a discussion, perhaps, or opening some new perspectives on what you just said about complicity, about ideology. I think all these, obviously, all these issues are interrelated, and about the question of what we can do, quote unquote, Russian soul or Russian DNA. Obviously, these are all essentialistic interpretation, and as such, we have to disregard them as human, people from the social sciences and humanistic sciences. However, I think that these questions, they do not stem from fundamentally racist point of view, saying that the Russians are just, some weird people, they're different than other people. They stem from, I think, a very just observation that there is a certain longue durée or long lasting of certain tendencies within the Russian societies, within the Russian political practice, within the Russian military atrocities and so on. Not only to the Second World War, as your project interprets, but also further down the past, even the 19th century, even the 18th century. And if such tendencies are perceived, it does not mean we have to automatically essentialize them, meaning that, well, okay, these are the Russians, that's how the Russians are. But however, we can think that perhaps there were some processes that happened or were happening in other societies that made them move away from certain behaviors that were historically more acceptable. And that some of these processes never happened within the Russian society, which would mean that, in a way, and that's my approximation, I would say that it's essentialism, but in a way cultural essentialism, saying that there is a certain there are certain long-lasting tendencies within the Russian. So it's not only that Putin nowadays or Hitler in the 1930s opened up in some conditions for the human, for the human behavior for the human beast to appear. But there are also certain historical processes and historical conditions that led to the moment that the authorities were able to do that. Thank you.
No, and that's sort of a good point. What are to give this sort of maybe another way that I can tackle that issue is one of the questions when I was passing around the manuscript to people to sort of get their thoughts was one of the issues that sort of loomed in the background is, well, Ukrainians were part of the Red Army too. They have the same Soviet sort of historical memory. They were part of the Red Army, and Ukrainians also were involved in the same atrocities. And this is where there's sort of a number of arguments that sort of highlight why we're not seeing, for example, the Ukrainians committing a wide number of war crimes or what have you. And it comes down to a couple of things, which is that one is that Ukrainian society and politics has attempted to democratize and done so much more successfully, whereas after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia had that sort of brief moment under Yeltsin where it tried, and then it reverted back to autocracy. So there's this sort of tension between a legitimate attempt to liberalize versus Russia's sort of descent back into autocracy there. There's also then the role of the military as well, in which, for example, Ukraine engaged in a series of reforms, and especially after the Russian invasion of Crimea and the Donbass, the Ukrainian military, this is when it reached out to other Western powers and tried to get, again, help to realizing that it could not be able to fight the Russian forces. And in that process, the Ukrainian military reformed significantly. And as a result, they became a much more sort of, quote, modern army in that way, whereas, at least for the Russian military, there's a sense that it still falls into certain Soviet norms. At the same time, there was an attempt to reform the Russian military in the 2010s. The belief, though, from many analysts are, though, however, with Putin's sort of key role in making this decision, one of the things that the reforms did for the Russian military was decentralize it, therefore putting much more emphasis on the role of individual officers and things like this, which would make it a much more modern army. But with Putin then re-centralizing the army under his control, has it allowed for some of those sort of norms that existed to sort of develop, even to sort of to redevelop or reform. Again, I would suggest that's not necessarily an issue of the DNA, but again, where you have then these norms that have been established over time and they're never challenged. It's some of the, to give another example, this might be another comment that I should just sort of generally make, and it's a comment I've heard in a variety of different contexts and conversations I've had here in Poland, and it's a very important thing to remember, which is that these atrocities that the Soviets commit during and after the Second World War are never in any way, they're never held accountable for it. There's no justice necessarily for them. And Fran Hirsch, the historian who wrote Soviet Judgment at Nuremberg, made this point very eloquently a couple years ago, which is that Vladimir Putin, the lesson he took from Nuremberg when the Soviets were not in any way held accountable, that then led him to understand he could do the same thing again today. And I think that also plays a role in which you then have this sort of sense that atrocity is useful and can be done, and again, in this case, with what is, and I argue that this is a genocidal and imperial war, is that, again, Putin doesn't believe he'll ever be brought to justice. And Russia still sort of, again, many leaders of Russia clearly seem to agree with him. And I think that plays more of a role in that case. And this is where I would say in that case, these are just norms that have become accepted in society that are informed by history. But again, I would still push back. This is not, again, inherent to the Russian DNA. This is learned behavior, essentially, in a different way. So.
Perfect, thank you. And we actually have a rather wonderful segue into a question that was posed online. What do you think about international accountability for current crimes? Is the International Criminal Court working the way it was designed?
Well, a bit of a loaded question. Obviously, in this case, it's not in the way that we hope it will work. The simple reality is that Russia doesn't accept the ICC jurisdiction, and so unless that changes, or Putin or any of the leaders who have arrest warrants out end up in a nation that does, realistically, the best we can hope for is a trial in absentia and at least a public sort of reckoning in that way. I think this is one reason why so many believe that Ukraine, the defeat of Russia, at least with regards to Russia's war in Ukraine, is so crucial. That is sort of necessary for any sort of next step that might prevent further aggression, or at least allow us to consider ideas of lasting peace. I think a comment that I've often made here, again, in having the discussions, is at this point, I don't know how realistic justice is. As much as I hope justice comes for Ukrainians for what they have gone through, for the atrocities and war crimes Russian forces have committed in Ukraine, I'm not sure how realistic that is. Even if there is a trial in absentia, realistically, given how Putin also instrumentalizes the political sort of realities, and he uses sort of what the West is doing. The sanctions are a great example. He's using that to show how the West, at least within Russian discourse, is holding Russia down or hurting Russian citizens. And so again, it might then play into his ability to further lead to this sort of us versus them mentality that draws, again, also on the history of the Cold War. That said, noting the atrocities, detailing the atrocities, making sure they're not forgotten is going to be such an important step for a variety of reasons. One, we know that it's important just to at least the acknowledgement that these events happened, the role that plays in healing. That's going to be a key aspect. The world helping Ukraine by providing the supports to allow, again, whether it is psychological supports to deal with psychological trauma, medical supports for medical trauma, to allow both the physical and psychological healing, that's going to be important as well. And I think the world can play a big role in ensuring Ukraine can rebuild itself that way. Again, I think accountability is going to be such a key part of this idea, especially when one of the things coming from North America, there's every once in a while this sort of discourse that develops, especially when we sort of see the machinations of certain European leaders. Is this leading to a sort of some idea of reintegration of Russia into European society, whether it's sooner rather than later, or which have you, regardless of how realistic it is, that discourse develops. I think before there's any discussion of any idea of Russian reintegration and anything like that, there needs to be accountability. And I think that accountability needs to be remembered in how Europe interacts, for example, with Russia, how nations interact with Russia. And the hope is that at least that accountability means that these atrocities and war crimes aren't forgotten. And that way, at least hopefully over time, even if it might not be under Putin's regime, but it might be under a future regime at some point, there can be some attempt either at reconciliation. It's going to take generations, realistically, I fear. That this is going to be one of those situations where this is going to be part of, I think, one, how Russia has to deal with Europe, but also going to typify Russian-Ukrainian relations, and for good reason. Ukraine is not going to just forget, and Ukrainians are not going to forget, but I think that is something that just having the accountability and not forgetting is going to be so crucial for whatever happens forward, and any sort of healing going forward, even if it means Russia remains outside of the European system, and even if there remains regimes in Russia that refuse to recognize the reality of the atrocities they have committed.
Thank you. Do we maybe have a last question in the room? Yeah, okay. Thanks.
Hello, Professor. I speak very loud, so first of all, sorry for wearing informal dress at a formal event. My question to you is, it's going to be when you mention about this seminar, which is about Ukraine atrocities. Of course, it should be paid attention, but don't you think that, look at Russia, what are they doing right now? They are organizing event, invest in Russia. Germans are participating in that. French are participating in that. December 1st, it was the National Day for Central African Republic. Russians and French were sitting together. The point is, atrocities should be remembered, should be paid respect. We do respect as an Indian. But what about future? Why Polish people are not focusing on future? What's the future? The territory of Ukraine, it's gone. It's gone. I know it's sad to say, but it's gone. Why I say it's gone? Look at Bashar al-Assad. Why Bashar al-Assad is removed from Syria? And now Israel is going to Syria. If you say that Russia cannot take Ukraine land, then what about Israel doing in Syria? So this will be questionable. So my question is just one thing. Respecting the atrocities is one thing, but what about focusing on future? It's more important. Thank you.
This is going to be the big question for Ukraine, and even just with regards to, in recent weeks, Zelensky has even started to say a ceasefire is on the table. I think the reality is that there's a couple of different questions there, and I think this is the one thing to remember with regards to, so I'll sort of look at with Ukraine. If we take the sort of the pessimistic outlook that Ukraine cannot liberate its territory, the issue is then, is Russia even willing to consider peace? And I think a lot of people believe that Russia, at some way, shape, or form will. And the problem there is a couple things. One, they've not in any way altered their demands. They maintain their maximalist demands. And again, this has been very much seen as a genocidal war. And so I think the problem is that we have to also be realistic about what's actually feasible in a variety of different contexts. I think that there is a sense, especially coming from North America, with Trump's election, there's this idea that he was going to end the war in 24 hours, that what have you. The reality is even if the Americans stop providing Ukrainians with weapons, Ukrainians are going to still resist. Ultimately, yes, a ceasefire might be signed, but then this just leads to another issue. Without security guarantees, we're at Minsk II again. We're at 2015. What stops Russia from being aggressive again? And I think the question has to be, if we're going to start thinking about the future, is that world leaders need to be realistic about what this war is, and as they should be with any war in the world, of what the war actually is, and they need to then consider what are they willing to stand for, what are they willing to fight for, what are they willing to support, what are they willing to fight against. And I think the reality is that if the goal is lasting peace with regards to Russia and Ukraine, I don't see any actual platform out there, in the sense that, in one sense, the world has not, especially like with the issue of slow drip support for Ukraine, that has removed certain options off the table for Ukraine, or at least made it much harder for them to liberate their territory. Russia has not fundamentally changed its approach, just to give that example. How do we square that circle? And I don't have a good answer to that. I've been thinking about it for years myself, as somebody who also studies international relations. The sad reality is that I think that we need to start having, as an international community, serious discussions about what is the world we want and what can be done to do that. And nations are going to have uncomfortable discussions within them about what world they're willing to fight for. And I think that's sort of going to really define probably the next decade, especially with regards to European affairs. Because again, what happens in Ukraine will have a domino effect in how other nations will also perceive the relationships with other nations. And also obviously with what do we do with Russia in terms of European politics. And so the reality is that, again, I don't have a good answer, but I also think that without firm decision-making, lasting peace is something that's also just not on the table, even as much as many of us may hope for it in some way, shape, or form.
Perfect. Are there any more questions in the room? because I thought that was rather a nice question, if a difficult question to end on about the future. Then I want to say to Oleksa, thank you so much for coming and giving this fascinating lecture, answering all of our questions, which were very difficult and very extensive and went beyond the scope of the book as well. And I also want to thank you on behalf of the Institute for coming here. Oleksa has done 4 different events for us in 4 days. He's been at a conference, he's given 2 seminars at the Institute. Now he's giving his public talk. We've driven him extremely hard. And he's come all the way from Canada at a very busy time of year in the academic year. So absolutely huge thanks to you, and huge thanks to those of you who've attended in person and those of you who've attended online. So a round of applause, I think, for Oleksa.
Thank you to everyone for coming.
All right.